Stalingrad, the Siege of Yorktown, the Battle of the Somme. History is full of defining moments and conflicts that shape the future. Yet is there one battle, the effects of which we are still feeling nearly 1,000 years later? The 14th of October, 1066, the Battle of Hastings, and a day when William of Normandy changed the face of Britain and Europe forever. A decisive victory over the Anglo-Saxons not only gave William the nickname of Conqueror, but also the title King of England. What came next was a change of culture, architecture, language, and the country's relationship with its closest neighbours for years to come. I'm James Hanson. This is Times Radio History, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus on a different historical battle, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today it's the Battle of Hastings, where a defeat for King Harold marked the end of Anglo-Saxon rule in England and the beginning of a new era. But what if Harold's army had won that day? What might the future have looked like? That's a question for our experts, and joining me as always is the historian and author Rear Admiral Dr. Parry. And for the first time on the channel, we're delighted to be joined by Robert Bartlett, Emeritus Professor of Medieval History at St Andrews University. Welcome to you both. Now, before we get into the events of the Battle of Hastings itself, let's just talk about the wider context. You can see in front of us we have a map of the British Isles and Normandy and France as it would have been back in 1066. A few key things to point out. Obviously here, highlighted, we have Normandy, we've got Caen, we've got Rouen. Then if we go across the Channel, you've got the area where the Normans landed at Pevensey, and then Hastings, of course, with the battle itself happening just north of Hastings. And then if we go further up into northern England, you've also got York and, crucially, Stamford Bridge, the site of the battle where King Harold defeated Harold Hardrada. Plenty to discuss. Robert Bartlett, we're delighted to have you on History Undone. First of all, can you just set the scene for us, 1066, what is happening, and crucially, why William feels he has a reason to invade the British Isles?
What kicks the whole thing off is something that was very, very common in medieval politics. That is a dispute about succession to the throne. The English king, Edward the Confessor, is getting on in years. He doesn't have any children. And obviously people are thinking, who is going to succeed him? That happens so often in medieval politics. In 1066, there are four possible claimants, two of them in England, two of them abroad. The ones in England are firstly a man called Edgar Atheling. Atheling is Old English. It translates roughly as prince. He's the only candidate who has any of the blood of the old Wessex royal house, the people descended from Alfred the Great, because the English royal family had been shattered and sent into exile 50 years before 1066, when the Danes had conquered England. So it was a very attenuated royal family. Edgar has some claim from his blood, but he has some disadvantages. He's quite young. He's probably about 14. He had been born and spent his early years in exile. He didn't have a power base. He wasn't well known in England. So despite having the only claim through blood, he's actually someone who's a fairly weak candidate. The other candidate in England is Harold Godwinson. He's completely different. He has no royal blood, but he's a very, very powerful man. He and his father, Godwin, had established themselves as the wealthiest and most important of the nobility in England. And Harold has a very distinguished military career, particularly fighting against the Welsh. And he's on the spot. You can think of him as a kind of strong man. And then there are two candidates from overseas. In Norway, there's Harold Hardrada. Hardrada means hard ruler, which gives you an idea of what kind of person he was. He's had an extraordinary career, a Viking traveling through the Mediterranean. And he thinks he has a claim to the throne because of complicated arrangements made in the previous dynasty when Canute and his sons were ruling England. And he's based obviously in Norway. And then finally, Duke William of Normandy to the south of England, as we've seen on the map. And he believes that he has been promised the succession by Edward the Confessor. And that's not entirely impossible. It's the Norman position, because Edward the Confessor, when the Danes had conquered England, Edward the Confessor had sought refuge in Normandy. Edward the Confessor's mother was a member of the Norman ruling dynasty. And so he actually was almost like a Norman by adoption. So it's possible that William's claim was right. So you have these four possible claimants. And then very, very swiftly at the beginning of 1066, events move with remarkable speed. 5th of January, Edward the Confessor dies. 6th of January, Harold Godwinson is crowned king. He's crowned in Westminster Abbey, which Edward the Confessor has just finished building. He's the first English king to be crowned in Westminster Abbey, in fact. And so he's now a crowned king in possession. And it's up to Harold Hardrada and William of Normandy to decide what they're going to do about it, which is what we'll see.
Dr. Chris Parry, I'm going to bring you in just a moment. We should just mention today, the 27th of September, is actually the anniversary of when William first set sail for England before landing the following day. But as Robert was mentioning there, Chris, what is interesting about 1066 is it's a year of 2 invasions. And so we should just mention what happens with Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge.
There's one character we haven't mentioned yet, and it's Tostig. He's the brother of King Harold. He'd been appointed Earl of Northumbria, but he's very unpopular, not only because it's part of the Danelaw, it's a very volatile part of the Danelaw as well. He's been imposing taxes, he's been really screwing down the local population, and of course, he's an alien. He's south of the Humber. And because of that, they demand that he is removed. And there's a standoff between Harold, the strong man in the south of England, and Edward the Confessor, and the local earls. And in the end, they get their way, and Tostig is exiled. So Tostig goes round various courts. We think he applies to Normandy and also Eustace of Boulogne to say, come and help me. He sends emissaries to Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, and says, look, why don't you come and assert your claim, and at the same time, you can reinstate me in the north. I'll be your man. And so what Harold does is say, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. He puts 300 ships together, a quite substantial army, typical of some of the great armies of the Vikings in the past. And he comes to invade Northumbria and captures York. Now, in capturing York, he is opposed by Edwin and Morcar, essentially 2 English earls at a place called Gat Fulford, which is just outside York. And the English earls, who are not very experienced, get defeated, and there's quite substantial casualties. And what then happens, while Harold hears about this, he comes north. The Norwegians actually camp around their ships on the River Derwent, and they are surprised by Harold when he arrives with the remnants of Edwin and Morcar's troops, but his own housecarls, his specialist troops, and the local Fyrd, which is composed of thanes and locals. And at that battle, Harold Hardrada was decisively defeated, even before they can get their armour on. And of the survivors, Harold Hardrada's son is allowed to go home in 24 ships, which are all that are required to take the survivors home. So this is a real slaughter by Harold and his troops of the Norwegians. Interestingly enough, the Danish king had sent some troops to help Harold as well. So because you can see the interaction there between the Danes at that time and the Norwegians.
So a decisive victory, and a very famous victory for King Harold and the Anglo-Saxons, Robert. But then, of course, within weeks, he's got another threat, because he's got William coming over, landing at Pevensey. Bring us up to speed with what happens between the Battle of Stamford Bridge and the clash at Hastings.
Well, we might go back a little bit to what William has been doing earlier in the year, because as soon as he hears of Harold becoming king, which is not what he recognized him as king, he regarded him as a usurper, he began to assemble a fleet. And for that, and the subsequent Battle of Hastings, for most medieval battles, you don't know very much information. It's not like modern times when you have lists, casualty lists and recruitment lists and long written records. You don't know very much about most medieval battles. But Hastings is unique in that it has a pictorial record, the famous Bayeux tapestry. And the Bayeux tapestry is an embroidery 70 meters long, which tells you the story of the build-up and the course of the Battle of Hastings from the Norman point of view. And one of the things it shows very clearly is that an enormous amount of preparation had been going on in Normandy in the summer of 1066. This was going to be a major maritime invasion. Ships are being built. We can see them being built on the tapestry. The Normans were by descent Scandinavians, Vikings, and they still had some of the traditions of Viking shipbuilding. You see ships with the dragon prows and so on. And William was recruiting people from all over northern France, well beyond Normandy. And this fairly large army, we don't know the size of it. It had a minimum of 700 ships, was recruited, and then it was just simply waiting for a favorable wind. And as has already been mentioned, Harold Godwinson had raised levies and put them along the south coast, but he couldn't keep them there forever. And in early September, he dismissed them because he just couldn't keep feeding them non-stop, doing nothing. And it's just at that point, of course, that what we've just heard about, Harold Hardrada and Tostig land in the north. So William of Normandy has an enormous stroke of luck, because Harold Godwinson has been facing this terrible dilemma, common dilemma, of a war on two fronts. Is Harold Hardrada going to come from the north, or is William going to come from the south? And Harold Hardrada comes first, and very, very soon after he lands, William gets a favorable wind and arrives landing at Pevensey, as we've heard. So now he's there, 250 miles south of where Harold Godwinson has just won his battle, and Harold Godwinson, King of England in his own eyes, decides that he has to go down and confront him there, particularly because one of the places that William has landed, the south coast of Sussex, that's not simply part of the Kingdom of England. It's also the Godwinson family estates, Harold's family estates. And we see depicted graphically on the Bayeux tapestry, the Normans burning and ravaging and plundering. There's a very moving picture of a woman and child escaping from a burning house, a very early picture of war refugees. And so Harold has to go down there and protect his own. And that's the immediate background to the events of October the 14th, the Battle of Hastings.
Let's zoom in now and let's look at Hastings itself and the battlefield, and let's look at what happened on that fateful day. Okay, so now we've got a new map of the battle itself in front of us. But before we get into that, let me just take you through some of the key stats about the Battle of Hastings. Now, as with much of medieval history, the exact numbers are difficult to know, but it's thought both armies had between 5,000 to 7,000 men. The Bayeux tapestry shows each side used horses, helmets, mail armour, shields, swords and bows. The English army had the housecarls at their disposal, one of Europe's strongest infantries at the time, and their key weapon was the two-handed battle axe, a very powerful weapon able to destroy shields, yet light at the same time. One of the Normans' main strengths was the large cavalry force of between 2,000 and 3,000 men. Bows and crossbows were their ace weapons, with an arrow leading to the death, supposedly, of King Harold. Between 6,000 to 10,000 men are thought to have been killed at the battle. We're going to get into the events of that day in a moment. Dr. Chris Parry, first of all, talk me through the topography of the Battle of Hastings, because that is crucial.
Yeah, I think we've got to start on the coast, because the coastline has altered significantly since 1066. And what we have to recognise is that William is actually stuck on a peninsula. And unless he can actually break out from that peninsula, he can't actually forage for food and also fodder for his horses. He also can't actually raid any further. And so what Harold is trying to do is actually lock him into that peninsula. Now, both sides, the sources say, send emissaries to each other. So the idea that Harold somehow surprised William is not true. And on the morning of the battle, they are both probing towards each other. And two of the sources at least say they come across each other. The Normans actually say, crikey, there's the Saxons up on the hill there. They arm, and then the battle starts early in the morning. Now, what is critical about the battle itself is this ridge line here on which the Saxons are. Now, if you go to the battlefield today, this edge here is pretty steep. And it was even steeper then, because right now you've got Battle Abbey sitting on top commemorating the battle itself, and quite a lot of the top of the ridge has been removed. And certainly I've gone to the battlefield with current cavalry officers, and they said, I'm not charging straight up that hill.
So he's in a great position, Harold.
He's in a great position, and if you look at what the sources say, he's flanked by water and by forest on both sides. So he's actually blocking the path for the Normans to get out. So it's up to the Normans either to tempt them down off there, or to break down what they call, and what is not called in the sources, a fortress of Saxons. They actually call it a fortress. Now, the army itself, this is a fairly sort of graphic representation, but the sources say that what the Normans had were archers and foot soldiers in front, foot soldiers behind, and squadrons of cavalry in the rear. So essentially, William's using his cavalry initially as a strategic reserve in case he's attacked. That's the point. But also, he's got to find out how he's going to work his way up onto this ridge, because I don't think the cavalry can go straight up. You're going to have to find a way in through the flanks at some stage, and I think we'll explain later how that was achieved.
Well, Robert, I mean, as Chris has outlined, this is in every sense an uphill battle for William. Going to set you a challenge now. Can you sum up in about 5 minutes or so the events of the Battle of Hastings? Good luck.
Thank you. There are two main written sources about the Battle of Hastings, and then there's the Bayeux Tapestry. The Bayeux Tapestry seems to show something, basically a battle between cavalry and infantry. That might have been an exaggeration of the people making the tapestry, because they might have wanted to show the leaders of the Normans in a good light, who were armoured knights. So you get these heavy cavalry depicted on the Bayeux Tapestry. They're wearing mail coats, they have helmets, they have swords and lances. I once did a calculation of how much metal one of these heavy cavalrymen would be wearing, including the horse. And it came to something like 22 or 23 kilograms of metal, which is an enormous amount given the rate of production of metal at that time. So they're very much a kind of elite. And the English do not fight on horseback. They have horses. They must have ridden between Stamford Bridge and Hastings, but they don't fight on horseback. And that's brought out very clearly by a fact that earlier, some years before Hastings, Edward the Confessor had brought some Normans over, and they tried to get the English to fight on horseback, and it had been a disaster. So this is a definite record that the preference and the training of the English, who were very good warriors, was for infantry fighting. And what you see in the Bayeux Tapestry is them with their large kite-shaped shields overlapping each other, standing. It's often called the shield wall. So it was a very strong defensive position, but of course it was a slightly more tricky offensive position. In the battle, we see three arms, as has been mentioned, on the Norman side: archers, who might well have been very important, infantry, and the heavy cavalry. And we see individual actions which can be correlated sometime with the written sources. The attack has to go uphill or roundhill. It's tricky. The role of leaders is very important. Very early on, there's a rumour on the Norman side that Duke William has been killed, and he has to rally the troops and show that he's not been killed. And he does that. He's shown doing this on the tapestry. He has to push back his helmet so you could see his face clearly, and then rally the boys and tell them, I am still here. So that was really very important. His half-brother, Odo of Bayeux, Odo of Bayeux is Bishop of Bayeux, so he's a priest, so he can't fight in the battle with a sword or a lance, because priests aren't allowed to shed blood. So he has an enormous wooden club, which he's using, because you can break someone's skull or a leg without shedding blood. And he's highlighted in the battle, which may well be because he's the patron of the tapestry. The battle is meant to last all day, starting about 9 o'clock in the morning. So it's a very long slog, and incidents that occur include an early break in the Norman line. It's the Breton contingent who are supposedly running away. The Normans might well look down their noses at Bretons, so perhaps that's why they said that. And at that point, some of the English break ranks to pursue them. They're now at the bottom of the hill and can easily be surrounded and killed by the Norman cavalry. And it's also possible that, having seen that happen, that the Normans then staged a couple of fake retreats. That is, they pretended to run away and then got the English to follow them. That is possible. It looks very much as if it's a matter of attrition. If the archers can shoot enough arrows to have a high casualty rate amongst the English, if the cavalrymen can get up at the top and from their superior height with their lances and swords do damage to the English ranks, if the English shield wall breaks, then the Normans have a chance to mop up. And the crucial moment is the slightly controversial scene of Harold's death. He's there with his brothers have been killed, and he is killed. And famously, there is a depiction of a figure with what looks like an arrow in his eye. And the Bayeux Tapestry has a short piece of written caption above every scene. And it says, "Here Harold is killed." That runs along a bit. And then next to that figure, there's a man on the ground, an English man on the ground being cut down by Normans. And there's been a lot of debate about whether, was that really an arrow? And did perhaps the tapestry get re-sewn with different events in it? Is the man being cut on the ground Harold? This has been going on for a long time. I think the crucial thing, however, is that Harold was killed, and there is no doubt about that. So towards the end of the afternoon, it's October, it's getting dark. The losses on the English side must have been mounting, obviously. The leader, the king, is cut down, and the English break and flee, pursued by the Normans. So it's been a long slog, but finally it's a clear Norman victory.
Robert, that is a brilliant summation. I know it's hard when you've got one of the world's leading experts on medieval history to get them to sum up the Battle of Hastings in 5 minutes, but you did it perfectly, so thank you so much. Dr. Chris Parry, anything you want to add to that? Yeah,
from the military point of view, it's quite interesting because whether this is a feigned retreat or, in fact, it really is a retreat is quite interesting because if you have the cavalry squadrons here as your reserve, you're going to bring them in at that point to actually neutralise the threat coming down the hill. Now, what's quite interesting is that William's horse is killed 3 times underneath him. Now, for him to be engaged at that point must be in dealing with this. Now, the fact that the Saxons have actually either deliberately gone down or have gone down thinking that the Normans are fleeing, what the effect is that it shortens the line here.
Yeah.
Harold has to draw in this line and shorten it. So the gaps appear in the flanks. And so if you combine an artillery attack through arrows, and one of the sources says that William says that you've got to aim high, you can then get your cavalry in the flanks here to deal with this shield wall, because I don't believe there was a frontal assault. If you go to the battlefield now, you cannot get horses straight up that hill in any sort of order. So the flanks must have been penetrated. So I think the effect of either that attack, it could have been a deliberate attack, or in fact them running down the hill to get after the Bretons and the others, whatever it was. And Robert knows that the feigned retreat was quite popular, you know, about that time, at the Battle of Cassel, 1071.
This was not a new tactic.
Not a new tactic. And of course, let's remember that Harold had spent some time in Normandy as William's enforced guest just before this happened. So he knows how William fights. So I'm not sure whether this is a deliberate attack from this flank or people just getting fed up with standing in the shield wall, getting hit with arrows. And we saw later in the British Civil War, Prince Rupert couldn't actually control his cavalry once he thought that the enemy was sort of fleeing. So you've probably got another incident here. Whether it's deliberate or not, it basically exposes that flank, and I think the Normans actually used their cavalry round the flanks and came in. What I find interesting about the sequence about King Harold being killed is he's actually called King Harold. It says Rex Haroldus on the tapestry, even though the Normans said he was a usurper. Quite interesting in that respect. And if you look at a previous sequence where Harold is departing from Bosham, it's actually like a moving picture cartoon. So you could have a sequence here where he is hit in the eye with an arrow and then chopped down by a subsequent Norman knight. So it could be a cartoon sequence, Mickey Mouse thing moving forward. So it could happen. But the fact of life is, as Robert says, there are two facts we know about the Battle of Hastings which are indisputable. The Normans won, and it went to the side that actually got its leader killed first. It's as simple as that.
But some really interesting tactical points there you raised, Chris. Before we start exploring the tactics in more depth and we start undoing the battle, Robert, we should just say, obviously, what makes Hastings so crucial is what follows, which is the Norman conquest is successful. By the end of the year, William is King of England.
Yes. Immediately after the battle, William didn't march in a straight line to London. That area was the Weald, as it's still called the Weald now, but it was very heavily forested at that time. It was fairly rough terrain. He worked his way round, picking up a few strategic sites on the way. He went from Hastings to Dover. Dover, then as now, the nearest point in England to the continent, and heavily fortified, then as now. He picked that up. Then he moved on to Canterbury, not far away, the ecclesiastical capital of England, then as now. And so he's picking up these strategically and symbolically important places. He sends a detachment over to Winchester. He doesn't go there himself immediately, which is where the royal treasury is kept. And then he advances on London. And he advances on London from the south. London is on the north bank of the Thames. At that time, as for many years afterwards, there was only one bridge over the Thames at London, London Bridge. And of course, as is well known, it's very, very difficult for an army to cross a bridge in the face of hostile opposition. So he does the sensible thing. He comes to the end of the bridge, has a look, and then he makes an enormous detour up the Thames in a huge circle, finally coming towards London from the northwest. And there, at Berkhamsted, the remaining leaders of Anglo-Saxon England come to submit to him, including Edgar Atheling, who was one of the claimants, the last surviving member of the Wessex royal dynasty, who some people have recognized as king after Hastings, but now he has come to submit and his backers have come to submit. And so William can enter London, and on Christmas Day, 1066, he's crowned king in Westminster Abbey, where his rival and defeated usurper Harold had been crowned the previous January, and he is now officially King of England, as well as Duke of Normandy.
Chris Parry?
Well, I think the thing that most people don't realise is, despite the fact that William is crowned king, and one of the provisions that him being crowned is that as long as the English show him loyalty, he won't oppress them or break their laws. He'll stick to their traditions and all that sort of thing. What we have now, though, is 5 years of insurgency. People don't accept the Norman conquest, and because quite a lot of the Norman peers and knights are out there trying to claim territory for themselves. They're being very barbaric in the way they seize territory. And some of the indications of how they captured land can be seen by how they invaded South Wales. There's a later source called Gaimar, and he says simply, when the Normans went into Wales, they basically had bands of knights who simply went and seized places. And he says, you know, if the Welsh were sensible, they married their daughters to the people and got protection in that way. But you've got all these adventurers fanning out, claiming land, oppressing the locals. And it creates this huge insurgency, which culminates in the harrying of the North about 4 or 5 years later. And it is only then that William feels slightly secure on the throne, because I think the scale of the insurgency in the records is underestimated, to tell you the truth. But as Robert and everybody knows, by the time of Domesday Book in 1086, virtually the whole top end of the nobility and thainage of England have been removed. and it's a totally Normanized aristocracy and top gentry level. And that shows you the extent of the resistance. And as we know, the Normans were famous for building these motte and bailey castles all over the country in order to hold down bits of the country while they obviously took control of it. I mean, one of the interesting things I find about the amphibious operation is they bring prefabricated castles with them. So they actually build 2 castles very quickly at Hastings and Pevensey. And people are so crikey, that's quite quick, chopping down wood. No, they've actually got prefabs. And that's a very advanced state of technology to be able to do that, to tell the truth. And again, in the invasion of Wales, you see these prefabricated castles moving forward and the earthworks remaining behind them.
There we go. We've talked about the real history of the Battle of Hastings and the Norman conquest. Now let's undo all of that history. This is History Undone. OK, we've got the same map of the Battle of Hastings in front of us. Robert Bartlett, to start with you, let's explore whether the battle itself could have played out differently. I mean, you know, going into it, Harold has the high ground. It is literally an uphill battle for William of Normandy. This could have played out differently, could it not?
It certainly could. It certainly could. I mean, I think the whole enterprise of Duke William's invasion was really very perilous. It's a maritime invasion. He's landing on a hostile shore. He has good luck in the sense that Harold is distracted by an invasion in the north at just the time when he wants to land in the south. So his main enemy is removed from the immediate scene. But he's still, you know, and he establishes a beachhead, but it's just a beachhead. And as has been pointed out, he builds 2 castles very quickly. The Normans are kind of coming to stay in their own minds. But when it actually comes to the confrontation, Harold has a strong defensive position. Maybe that's the weakness. Maybe that Harold needs to have an offensive approach to dealing with William. William's troops, as depicted in the tapestry, you know, cavalry quite dominant, the English infantry, but as has been shown many times, you know, cavalry don't always beat infantry. I mean, this is not a kind of magic wand on the field of battle. And then I think the point about the leadership, it was disastrous for the English that Harold was killed. What if William had been killed? He was in the thick of the battle. It's been pointed out, three horses killed under him. The rumor that he was dead. If William had been killed, it could have been one of the great disasters of Norman pride and overreaching. So it could certainly have turned out differently. And the fact that the battle lasted all day certainly suggests that it could have been a bit different. And Harold, as just been pointed out, Harold was actually, one account anyway, has Harold in London on the way south being counselled by his family. Wait, get some more forces. You don't have to dash down there. But he did dash down there. And with the result we know. Yeah,
I mean, just to pick up on that, Chris, why was the death of Harold so significant? I mean, look, clearly he is King of England, so there's a symbolic importance. But did it also matter from a kind of military tactics point of view?
Yeah, it's really interesting. One of the sources says his brother Gerd says, look, you don't have to fight. We'll do this for you. Brother Leofwin and I'll do this. You stay back with the other troops. But it's quite interesting. If you look at Edmund Ironside, one of the West Saxon kings fighting against Canute, his father, Ethelred, known as the Unright, he's not at the battle, even though he's seriously ill. And the troops don't want to fight without the king. They won't fight with Edmund Ironside. They refuse to do it. So you could have a situation here where if Harold doesn't turn up, quite a lot of the people aren't going to play. Now, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle E version is pretty explicit. The reason why Harold loses this is because not all of his troops turned up. A, because they didn't want to, maybe, and there's a rumour that he didn't distribute the booty from Stamford Bridge to enough people. But I think he's hurried down through the Weald. He wants to get into his estates and protect his people. They're probably crying out for leadership as well. I think there are other reasons, emotional reasons why he might want to confront William very quickly. But I think the overwhelming thing is to bottle up William and his troops in this peninsula here. If he can block that, last all day, wait for more troops to arrive, it's over for William, because he can't sustain the logistics of his army for very long. I think I've said before many times, and I've written, all Harold has to do here is not lose.
Yeah.
That's all he has to do. And frankly, as we've been discussing, at the tactical and the operational level here, you can say that William is not just William the Bastard, he's William the Lucky Bastard all the way along here. And the tapestry bears that out. What I find interesting is on the tapestry, the person who gets the most mentions is a chap called Eustace of Boulogne. He's actually here on the right somewhere. And although Odo, of course, is thought to have commissioned the embroidery, tapestry, and of course William is the centre of it all, it's actually Eustace that appears most in the tapestry itself. I mean, we know we've lost some of the tapestry, but I find that very interesting. So what role did Eustace of Boulogne play, for example? Is he on this flank coming in and driving in on the Anglo-Saxons? But frankly, if I'd have been Harold and his brothers, I'd have been confident on this day. We've just got to withstand this. We can't see the cavalry getting up here as long as we maintain the shield wall. What he hasn't got, though, which is what he had at Stamford Bridge, is archers. Because Harold Hardrada was shot through the throat with an arrow. And we know that he had archers, and he probably hasn't been able to bring them south in the time that's been allowed. So one of the critical things may have been that he didn't have his archers with him.
Well, that's a really good point, and I want to come on to the impact the Battle of Stamford Bridge and the Norwegian invasion may have had on the events of the Battle of Hastings in a moment. Robert, the feigned retreat that everyone talks about, if it doesn't happen or it plays out differently, if the Saxons don't fall for it, as it were, how big a difference would that have made?
Can I mention something else first, which is from the point that's just been made about the importance of the rulers actually being on the battlefield, because that can be backed up, I think, by a rather interesting comment. About 30 years after the Battle of Hastings, the First Crusade was launched, and thousands of knights went out to the Holy Land. On their way, they went through Byzantium. The Normans were establishing themselves not only in England at this time, but in southern Italy. And so the Normans were very well known and respected as sometimes as allies and sometimes as enemies by the Byzantines. And the daughter of the Byzantine emperor, Anna Komnene, wrote a history in which she observes the following about Norman tactics and Norman battle psychology. She says, amongst them, the generals and leaders are always in the thick of the battle. They have to be in the front of the line. Unlike our generals, the Byzantine generals, who stay at the back and command the operations from a distance. So that particular perception, which I think is quite right, of the need for the leaders to be fighting in the front line, which was true both of Harold and of William, and which makes a particular vulnerability to this kind of warfare. That, I think, is something that is borne out not simply by the accounts of this battle, but by an observation of someone from a slightly different culture, a Byzantine princess, just in the generation following. But to go back to your feigned retreat, if it was a feigned retreat, it's clearly possible that the William's army might have broken at some point or another. It's not an enormous area we're talking about, but it's an extended area, and you're going to have weaknesses and individual circumstances affecting it. So sure, I think you can't write the history of the Battle of Hastings as a foregone conclusion. And then just another point to go back to something that's been mentioned. The Battle of Hastings wasn't the Norman conquest. Yeah, it's put very well about the insurgency there. It always astonishes me that after winning the battle, after being crowned, just in March 1067, William decides that it's perfectly safe for him to go back to Normandy for almost the rest of the year. It's either a remarkable misjudgment or it's an enormous vote of confidence for his lieutenants and his half-brother Odo and other people left behind. because he seems to think that he is no longer needed immediately in England. And of course, one of the things that happens then is this prolonged English resistance down in the southwest, in Exeter, famously in the fens around Ely, Hereward the Wake, who became a legendary figure but was really a real figure, and particularly York, in the north, where you find the King of Scots comes down, Edgar Atheling goes into revolt, the Danes turn up. It's really a desperate situation in the early years. So even the Battle of Hastings itself it's decisive in one sense. It sets the situation for the following years, but it's not the same as the Norman conquest of England.
That's a very good point, and I want to come on to that, and whether, if the Battle of Hastings is lost by the Normans, does that necessarily mean that the threat of invasion and Norman conquest is over? But we'll come on to that in a moment. Chris Parry, I do want to ask you, just on the point about what happens preceding the battle, if the invasion from Harold Hardrada had not taken place, if the Battle of Stamford Bridge had not taken place, does that fundamentally alter what happens at the Battle of Hastings? Because, fundamentally, Harold hasn't had to fight off an invasion a few weeks beforehand.
We can't know. I suspect if Harold had remained in the south, it would have been easier to get the Shire levies together. So he'd have had a bigger army. I suspect his navy, which was still in existence, but we think was round in London at the time, could have been brought round to intercept the Norman fleet. In fact, William the Conqueror's ship, the Mora, which had been given to him by his wife, was actually isolated during the transit across. So you can imagine if the Anglo-Saxon navy had captured William on the way across, that would have been quite significant. But I think in terms of what is going on here, I think the tactics would have been different. Harold would have actually waited to get his levies together. He'd have got a bigger army. I suspect he would also have had a separate force that would have been able to attack William in that peninsula, and he would have sealed the neck of the bottle. That would have what I would have thought, and then would have been in a position to intercept the ships when they departed. It's quite interesting that William's ships didn't all land at Pevensey. Some landed at Romney and were totally cut up by the locals. And in fact, the Normans slaughtered the inhabitants afterwards. So they landed on a fairly broad front and had to be brought together. So I think there would have been a difference. There's no question about that. He wouldn't have lost so many housecarls in the north. You wouldn't have had the Battle of Fulford. He could have brought Edwin and Morcar south with him to the south, and the whole sort of machinery of Anglo-Saxon England could have generated quite a substantial force. What is significant after Hastings, though, is at no time can the Anglo-Saxons bring together the size and complexity of force that Harold brought together at Hastings. They can never do that again. So you've lost the top level aristocracy and the top of the what we would call gentry now. So the leadership has gone. They can never ever bring together a force of this size that can take on William if he really concentrates his forces.
And Robert Bartlett, just finally on the battle itself before we get into the long-term consequences. Obviously, the Normans have an advantage in terms of they've got 2,000 or 3,000 cavalry. How big a difference does that make?
I think it makes an enormous difference. I think this is the period when heavy cavalry are kind of coming into their own. As I've already said, cavalry do not always beat infantry. But there's a long period from the 11th century to the late 13th where they are often fairly decisive on the battlefield, and they're appreciated in that way. You get people, for example, the kings of Scots recruit Norman cavalry as a kind of elite military force. The Danish kings recruit German knights, mounted knights, for the same reason. So they're being recognized as a significant force on the battlefield. And it's only really around about the year 1300, so quite a long time later, that there are decisive defeats of mainly cavalry armies or armies with a very high level of heavy cavalry by infantry forces. And you have a series of defeats in which the urban levies of Flanders and the Swiss and so on and so forth actually beat these armies with heavy cavalry. but it's beginning to be. This is the kind of heart of the period in which it's very significant.
Chris Parry, very briefly.
So, if we look at modern warfare, we're always talking about the role of the tank. And also, you can't send tanks in without support from infantry because they get taken out by anti-tank weapons.
Yeah.
This is not good tank country, and it's not good for armoured knights.
Yeah.
So, unless you do a combined arms operation here with your artillery, your archers, your foot soldiers, and your cavalry together, you're not going to win this because you've actually got very good anti-tank, anti-armour up here on the hill. And so what William's managed to do, either by accident or by design, he's actually conducted a combined arms operation against this defensive shield wall here. And as I've said, your armour, your cavalry is going to be no good here unless it can get up here on this hill. And the critical thing, as we've said, is when these flanks become exposed because Harold has to draw in his flanks to reflect what's happened here. And that's when the cavalry manage to get into the battle. The tanks break through, if you like, to actually deal with the infantry in the flanks.
Well, this is absolutely fascinating. I think what we've learned is that the Battle of Hastings itself could have played out very differently. Now let's get into what we love doing on History Undone and ask ourselves what the long-term consequences would have been had the Battle of Hastings not been won by the Normans. OK, this is going to be really fun because I don't think we've looked at any one battle so far on History Undone that has quite so many long-term consequences as the Battle of Hastings. Robert Bartlett, to begin with you, are we saying that if the Battle of Hastings is lost by William, that means the Norman conquest has failed and won't be able to succeed, or is there still the threat of a Norman invasion?
I think if he'd been defeated at Hastings, I think then that would have been very decisive, or particularly, of course, if he'd have been killed. I mean, that would have changed the whole nature of the politics of the subsequent years. I mean, to say that Hastings doesn't deliver England into his hands, which is true, is one thing, but it certainly is an essential step on the Norman conquest of England. What some people argue, and it may be the case, is that the really thoroughgoing dispossession of the native English aristocracy might not have happened if there hadn't been the years of opposition and rebellion after 1066, which they continued for many years, often in alliance with outside monarchs such as the kings of Scots or the Scandinavian rulers. But we get a picture of what happened very clearly, just as there's the unique source for the battle in the Bayeux Tapestry, so there's a unique source for what happened afterwards, in the 20 years afterwards, in the Domesday Book. Domesday Book records a survey that William commissioned in 1086, so exactly 20 years after the battle. And it's the most amazing document. It's unique. It covers virtually the whole of England, with one or two minor exceptions. It looks at something like 13,000 places, and it tells you for each of them what that place was worth, what its tax liability was, who the peasant tenants were, how many of them, what classes they were, free men, villeins, slaves. It tells you things about meadows and churches. In some parts of the country, it tells you how many pigs there were. It's just astonishing. So you can work out what England was worth in 1086. It was worth £72,000. Now, that wouldn't get you a flat in London now, but of course you have to take inflation into account. But more significantly than that figure, it tells you what the division was between the various groups. 50% of England, by value, was owned by Norman barons. 20% was owned by the king, himself, of course, a Norman. A quarter, 25%, was owned by the church. And by this time, the top level of the church, that means the bishops and the great abbots and so on, more or less all the English had been replaced by Normans and other foreigners, which leaves 5% to the Old English aristocracy. So that's a major dispossession. I mean, it's like the society having its top just sliced off. And I think two enormous consequences follow from that, both of them related to the fact that this is a foreign conquest. One is linguistic. the change in language, and the other is political, because in 1066, what happens is, for the first time, a king of England is also lord of a large part of France. And that continues to be the case for 500 years, almost exactly 500 years. It doesn't cease to be true until the reign of Mary Tudor. So that whole period from 1066 on, England is now linked to France in a way it hadn't been before. And French language is the dominant language of the ruling class for many generations. And so you have those two enormous consequences of that radical dispossession of the old English rulers.
Some really good points there. I mean, it can't be said often enough. We would be speaking a very different language right now. This would not make sense to any of our viewers had the Battle of Hastings played out differently. Well,
certainly English would not have developed the way it did with all the in-words coming from Latin and French, Norman French in particular. What I think would have been different is that we would have been aligned on a Nordic axis. I mean, the history up until then had been obviously Anglo-Saxon, Danish, Norwegian, Viking. And I think you'd see a greater integration of England with those countries. And as Robert says, you know, the link with France would have continued through trade and culture and things like that. But all sorts of things would have fallen out from that. The Anglo-Saxons never really, towards the end of the period, said they were going to invade Wales. First thing the Normans did when they got into the British Isles was to start moving into South Wales. So the history of Wales would have been different in that respect. Now, let's look across the channel into Normandy. If William's killed, the Count of Anjou and the King of France are looking very greedily at Normandy and saying, well, actually, this is an opportunity for us. And one of the things I always find amazing about 1066, it's the only year, really, where it would have succeeded, because 10 years before, Normandy was fighting for its life as a duchy against its neighbours. 1063, for example, Harold wouldn't have been vulnerable in the way he was by 1066. Everything would have changed. But so Normandy possibly becomes part of the Kingdom of France or is taken over by their great rivals from Anjou. That's the first thing. You've also got to remember that there's quite a considerable contingent from Boulogne and Flanders here. So that's going to be destabilised by its rulers being removed at the moment. So there's that. Now, within England itself, Robert's already mentioned it, the church stays Anglo-Saxon. So quite a lot of our cathedrals don't get built because they're fundamentally, quite a lot of them are of Norman origin. Some of them aren't even in the same places. So, for example, Chichester Cathedral, Norman foundation, was at Chelsea. And various other cathedrals around the country, for example, there's one at Thetford in Norfolk. So we'd have our cathedrals in different places. We wouldn't have the castles that we have today in the same sense that we know them from the Norman period, the Motte and Baileys, which are so distinctive. But what's really interesting is that the moneying, the legal apparatus, the administration stays the same. Because the Normans say, look, this looks great. It's better than we've got in Normandy, actually. And if you look at the way in which the military organisation took place in Anglo-Saxon, and it's very close to the feudal system. You hold land in return for military service. And although it's not exactly the same, the way the Anglo-Saxons set it up is actually more efficient. If you look at the tribal hidage, as it's called, and these other documents that give you the military liabilities, you overlay those two, you bring Domesday Book in, you've got a very powerfully administered state, which is then to the benefit of Henry I when he comes in.
And just on the language, I mean, it's worth stressing. Obviously, it's significant to us in the UK, but, you know, English is one of the world's most popular languages. So what you're speaking in the USA today would be very different. What people are speaking all over the Anglosphere would be very different. Robert Bartlett, just to pick up on that point about sort of architecture and things, castles not being built and the way our cathedrals and churches are designed. I mean, England today would look incredibly different.
Well, I would... I'd bring in what the scientists would call a kind of control experiment. I'd bring in the Kingdom of Germany. In 1050, before the conquest, the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Germany looked very similar. They were similar in culture, similar in social organisation. England was smaller, but it was also very efficiently governed, a rather centralized form of governance for the 11th century, and had a really good coinage. Its silver pennies were the most uniform in terms of weight and silver content of any in Western Europe. If you then say, okay, well, what happened in Germany that would have happened in England? And I distinguish two things. So I just take two of the points that have been discussed. Castles. In 1050 or so, neither England nor Germany had very many castles. They'd been developing in northern France from where they spread. In the case of England, they were introduced by the Normans, and very quickly. We've already mentioned 2 were built in the 2 weeks between the Normans' landing and the Battle of Hastings, and hundreds were built in the next generation or two. And many of them were these motte baileys, which were artificial mounds of earth with a watchtower on the top and wooden fortifications and so on. But some of them, of course, are still there. The Tower of London is the most famous example. You know, the Tower of London was stuck into the corner of London in order to keep an eye on the capital. So yes, the Normans did that. But if you look at Germany in the late 11th and 12th century, it's being completely covered with new castles. Any aristocratic family with ambition is building castles. There's one famous man, he's an ancestor of a later royal dynasty, and it's said he carried a castle at his horse's tail. Everywhere he went, he built castles. So you've got there that control experiment. The encastellation of England was indeed one of the things that happened immediately after Hastings. But it probably, if we're going to use this term, would have happened anyway. The other example, which is a counterexample to that, the opposite case, is the linguistic thing, which we've already mentioned. In 1050, England was distinctive in that it had a fairly large written body of material, not in Latin, which was the learned language which was common throughout Western Europe, but in its own vernacular, in English. That was rare, that was unusual. And with the Norman conquest, that stopped. And English, it's an exaggeration to say English went underground, but it ceased to be a high status written language. The 12th and much of the 13th century are the lowest periods for the production of writing and literature in English. It kind of revived, of course, at the end of the Middle Ages, and we have Chaucer and so on. But for a long period, French and Latin were the languages of rule and the languages of learning and so on in England. And during that period, the English language simplified dramatically. It's been mentioned already, the number of words come into English from French and Latin, but also the grammar simplifies dramatically, because in 1050, English was just like German. German still is today. It has the nouns have 3 genders. They have 4 cases. That's why it's such a nightmare to learn.
Heavily inflected.
German hasn't changed in the way that English did because of that suppression of the native language. And if you go from Old English to modern English, there is more of a change, a much greater change, than there is from Old High German to modern German or Old French to modern French. And that, as you've already pointed out quite rightly, is really important, because that's, English has become a bit of a world language. Whether it will stay a world language, I don't know. But the kind of language we're speaking today on this very moment is the shape it is because of the Norman conquest.
Chris Parry, can I ask you about some of the kind of global consequences of the Battle of Hastings? I mean, had it played out differently? Did the Crusades happen?
Oh yeah, the Crusades certainly happened. I think there was already some of the stirrings of that in Spain, and Robert knows all about this. He's an expert on this. And certainly towards the end of the 11th century, you'd have seen quite substantial bodies of troops moving to the east to help the holy places and the Byzantine Empire. I think that was already in play. There's a Peace of God movement which said we've got to stop these people fighting each other. I mean, what's interesting is that one of the leaders of the First Crusade, of course, is William the Conqueror's son, Robert, who presumably actually wouldn't have survived either the dynastic struggles here or, if his father hadn't survived, actually sort of been promoted to that extent. So he wouldn't have gone to the east. So one of those would have disappeared. But I do think the movements would have occurred. They were already in play. And there was this momentum. One thing we shouldn't forget, and it contributes partly, I think, to the number of people who take part in the invasion of England, there's a huge demographic crisis here. There's far too many people in arms for the land available. And so this is a godsend to any adventurer. We're going to take over this huge country here. We're going to actually have land for people that can't have it. And part of the motivation of going to the east was we've got huge land hunger here in Western Europe. Let's go and find it somewhere else.
I also think we would be looking back today at King Harold in a very different light. You know, you stop your average person in the street now in the UK and say, tell us about King Harold. They'll say he had an arrow through the eye at Hastings. If he managed to successfully defeat William at Hastings, he would go down as the man who fought off 2 invasions in 1 year. He would be like Nelson.
Well, it's quite extraordinary because he would be leading a very rich country that, as you say, has seen off 2 major combatants. So his military reputation is huge. He will be feared. There's no question about that. And he's also got a huge number of relatives who are going to establish a dynasty for him. And he's got sons by 2 women. Certainly, and they appear later in the insurgencies. And he's also got 2 brothers who actually are very powerful and very loyal. So for the first time in probably 50 years, this country is looking incredibly strong and rich at the same time. And so its ability to project power, I think, into the North Sea and across into the Nordic regions is very powerful. But here's the thing. There may also have been a temptation to actually go into Normandy.
Could work in reverse.
If you're that powerful, actually, you might want to sort out what some of the relatives that are still hanging in the wings have in terms of an agenda here.
We could talk about this for hours, so big are the consequences. Robert Bartlett, just to give the final thought to you, would you go so far as to say the Battle of Hastings is certainly the most significant turning point in English history, and potentially even one of the most in world history?
World history, I would probably hold my advice on that. I'll have to learn a lot more world history first. But I think in English history, if we're talking about something that happened on a day, that's the thing, isn't it? Like battles which happen on a day usually, or in this period anyway. Yes, it's a very radical rupture in English history, which was a result of military action in 1066. Yes, I would say that.
Just one thing else. There's one thing in the established tradition that I think wouldn't occur if Harold had won at Hastings. King Arthur wouldn't be such a big deal because all the Arthurian romances come out of Geoffrey of Monmouth and this French Latin tradition that has come across. And I just wonder if King Arthur would be such a big deal if Harold had won at Hastings.
It's a very interesting point. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for today, but some absolutely enormous consequences stemming from what happened back in 1066 at the Battle of Hastings. First of all, the most obvious thing is that the language we're speaking right now would be very, very different. You would not be able to understand the words I am saying had William lost at Hastings. But then for the next 1,000 years, the relationship between England and France would be very different. The way the United Kingdom is set up would be very different. Would it even be the United Kingdom we know today? We've spoken a bit about the relationship with the Welsh and the fact that then, of course, you had a very different relationship between the English and the Welsh after 1066. Globally, who knows? The Crusades almost certainly still happen, but there are some fundamentally enormous consequences, all stemming from one battle on one day back in 1066. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much to Professor Robert Bartlett and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me. And we'll be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, Times Radio History, on YouTube. And if you like this, why not subscribe to Times Radio's main channel, where you can catch me presenting Frontline, our interview series about the war in Ukraine and other global conflicts. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.